Welcome back to Keiser Report Summer Solutions. We're going to talk about the problem of the U.S. dollar. But is there a reserve currency? The global unit of account confers an exorbitant privilege on but a few, high price on the many, in our opinion. We're going to be joined by Dr. Michael Hudson, author of Forgive Them Their Debts. Dr. Hudson, welcome.
Good to be back, Max.
Oh, righty. So the title of your book is, in fact, Forgive Them Their Debts. Probably indicates what your solution is to the household debt crisis. So let's start with the problem. Why is there so much household debt, in particular, the role of the U.S. dollar in that?
The main reason for household debt is because it costs more and more money to buy a house. And the largest debt that most families have is also their largest asset, their home. And since 1945, the lending terms have become looser and looser, and banks have lent more and more money for every house. And if you want to ask, what creates the value of the house? Well, a house is worth whatever a bank is going to lend. And if it used to be in 1945, and when I came to New York in the 1960s, working for mortgage lenders, banks would limit the loan that they'd make for you to buy a house to, the mortgage would be 25% of your income, and you'd have to have 20 or 30% down payment. Well, once they make loans up to 42% of your income and federally guaranteed, and once you don't have to make any down payment at all, and once you don't even have to pay interest, then obviously you have a gigantic increase in the cost of a house because banks will lend other buyers and bidders much more money to buy the house. So you have to go more deeply into debt today to buy a house than people do in any other country. In Germany, for instance, homeowners and renters pay about 10% of their income for housing. In America, it can be up to 42% federally guaranteed. So there's been a huge increase in the financialization of real estate, and that makes people go into debt for the house. And they have to pay so much debt for the house that they break even by taking out a credit card debt. Also education. When I went to school, I think at NYU graduate school cost maybe $650 a year. Now it's $65,000 a year. It's 100 times that. My rent was $35 a week, a month away from NYU. Now it's $3,500 to $4,500 a month. So again, you have just a thousandfold increase. So all these things have pushed people into debt. And that's why the economy hasn't been growing in the last 10 years. People are paying their money for debt service, not to buy the goods and services that they produce.
Right. Now, you said something interesting there that sounds good on the surface. You say, lending requirements got easier. You mean I can borrow money more easily? Yeah, you can. But what you're describing there is, by making the credit so easy to access for a home, in fact, has created this crazy world where the value of the debts go up, whereas at the same time, wages are not going up. And thus you have this incredible spread.
You're right. I've been a sucker. I'm using the public relations rhetoric that the bankers have used.
You're using public relations rhetoric. But in factual...
I shouldn't have said easier. I should have said more leveraged.
Okay, but why did you do that? It's because it's part of our easy come, easy go culture. You know, we live in this easy culture, disposable culture, and most people would assume that that's a good thing, and they get suckered into, for example, you mentioned education. Why would anyone borrow a couple $100,000 to get a 4-year degree? They're just servicing the financial markets. They cannot possibly have value to that degree at that extent. Dr. Hudson.
That's right. They realize that it's something that they can't even think about economically. They think we need a BA and an advanced degree just to become counted in the middle class, just like you need a house to count a middle class. And your status depends on your education and your home ownership. And in a world where status is how you define yourself, to be the kind of status that you feel comfortable in, and not to lose the status, not to have a lower status than your parents, not to have a lower status than the kids you went to high school with. You have to somehow get on the debt treadmill, which of course lowers your economic condition even more, all in the interest of trying to maintain your status, which turns out to be a losing game.
Like they sell cars and chewing gum and lipstick, that it's something that makes you cool. People then become debt prisoners, and their mobility is curbed, and then you have a lot of anxiety. And you don't have that sense of self-sovereignty. I wanted to look at a chart here for a second, the Great Prosperity from 1947 to 1979, where pay rose along with productivity, and then starting in 1980 to the current period, that's not true. You have productivity is gaining, but without the commensurate rise in pay. And this is kind of part and parcel with this whole debt question and the whole picture as you describe it. But can you talk a little bit about that?
It's a trick question. You love to ask trick questions. The question is, what is productivity? And productivity is the increase in GDP relative to the amount of the laborers working. And what is the increase in GDP? Well, if you look at it, there are amazing things that have nothing to do with more production at all. For instance, what happened in 1980 in England under Margaret Thatcher and America under Ronald Reagan? For one thing, you had the privatization, especially of housing. Now, as housing goes up, then the rental value of homeowners, what they would have to pay themselves for rent if they rented out their home, is multiplied 100 times. All that's counted as an increase in GDP, and it should be counted as a cost. It's not productivity. It's an extractive charge. It means that it costs people more and more to live. Same thing with financialization. As financial profits have gone up, especially in the form of late fees and penalties, and returns over and above the basic interest rates, all this is not counted as something that's extracted from GDP. That's actually counted as growth. So increase in GDP means more money to the 1%. Or the 10%, and less money to the 90%. So productivity is actually defined as a transfer of income from wage earners to the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, to the pharmaceutical monopolies, the health management companies, the banks, and real estate.
How come
it has nothing to do with production at all. It's a fake number.
How come left-wing politicians don't strive to redefine GDP?
I'm doing something exactly for that for Democracy Collaborative in Washington with Gar Alperovitz, but most of the left doesn't look at economics. It's just amazing. And even in China, I'm told they're sending their students to study economics in the United States. Somehow the left wing has been taken over by people who aren't really left-wing at all. They say, to be left-wing, you have to talk about identity politics, sexual politics, ethnic politics, racial politics, but not the identity of wage earners, not the identity of anything economic. That is excluded from the left wing. And, I'm sure there's been an infiltration and takeover and very heavy subsidy by the mighty Wurlitzer to prevent any discussion of economics. And certainly where we do have a left-wing academic curriculum in Kansas City, it's University of Missouri there, it's almost impossible for our graduates to get prestigious jobs in other universities because the academic curriculum in the United States is dominated by the right-wing Chicago School and the libertarians, and so there's no way that a left-wing academic can actually get a job in academia, so they go wherever they can, and there's simply nothing like the left wing a century ago that was all about economics.
Yeah, if you have the measuring stick, you're going to win the argument. So the the focus should be on changing the measuring stick.
That's exactly what
at least you can have
I'm
a
doing
debate.
now.
Okay, let me move on here. So, Congressman Brad Sherman recently said in the House Financial Services Committee, and I quote, "An awful lot of our international power comes from the fact that the U.S. dollar is the standard unit of international finance and transactions. Clearing through the New York Fed is critical for major oil and other transactions. It is the announced purpose of the supporters of cryptocurrency to take that power away from us, to put us in a position where the most significant sanctions we have against Iran, for example, would become irrelevant." So this is right in your lighthouse. This is your old job on Wall Street.
Indeed.
Tell us about, first of all, is that correct? Does everything go through the New York Fed as he's describing?
And since he mentioned Iran, let me tell you what happened when Khomeini took over in Iran. Iran government had very heavy deposits in the United States, and their paying agent was Chase Manhattan, the bank that I used to work for. They directed Chase to make the timely payment on their foreign debt. Chase was told by the CIA and the Treasury Department, don't make this payment. It refused to pay to let the check be written, so Chase held up the Iranian payment, violated every responsible legal obligation, and the United States said, aha, Iran's in default, we're now going to grab all the money. And that is the result of the whole horrible half century that's occurred since that time.
Okay, question. Does the world need a neutral unit of account for trade? And if so, will the U.S. be willing to relinquish its orbitant privilege?
That's another trick question. There's no neutral unit of account. What the congressman feared to say was China and Russia using their own currency. Right now, there's de-dollarization.
He referred to Bitcoin as a neutral unit of account, as many would argue that is the case.
There's no way that other governments are going to use Bitcoin. The volume is just too vast, and there's too many insecurities in Bitcoin. What the governments are doing for de-dollarization is using the Chinese currency, the yuan, and the Russian currency and other non-dollar currencies, so that at no point do they have to go through an American bank and pay in dollars at all. So the United States cannot impose sanctions by interfering with the payment mechanism like it illegally did in the case of Iran after Khomeini took over.
He referred to the dollar as being the basis of the America's financial hegemony in the world. I mean, you wrote a book called Super Imperialism, I believe it was called.
That's exactly it.
And is that not the base case of that?
Yes, it is. The dollar indeed is. And the question is, what will the alternatives to the dollar be? And you can be sure that China, Russia, and other countries, and even Europe now, are trying to figure out how do we make our economy operate without any reference to the dollar at all.
Got to cut her off there. We'll come back after a break and continue this conversation with Dr. Michael Hudson on the Summer Solutions Show. Don't go away. Welcome back to Summer Solutions Keiser Report. We're going to continue with our conversation with Dr. Michael Hudson. Dr. Hudson, we're going to continue our conversation. Now, you mentioned 1953, Iran, basically the imposition of the Shah at that time, I believe is what happened.
No, I meant Khomeini's replacing the Shah, which occurred later on, when the United States refused to make the payment that Iran already had the money of to service its foreign debt, and that was the excuse that it announced a default.
This is using the dollar as a weapon.
Yes.
There's been a lot of examples since then where people in the United States who have control of the puppet strings of the global finance. In the case of Julian Assange, they cut him off from various PayPal and other services. And we're using the dollar and payment systems and SWIFT as a way to the global empire of the United States. This is how it's managed. It's not necessarily a territory, an empire of territory, but it's an empire of debt. And as long as they can keep folks in debt, especially in Central America, South America, the U.S. can always either have them default on that debt, they can put in a puppet. In Argentina, they've been defaulted many times over the years. I mean, exactly. This dance they do with Citibank and other banks, this is the U.S. basis of their power. What are some of the other examples? Walk us through that. And I should mention, it's kind of interesting historically because people are now getting exposed to this kind of meddling by the banks on their personal accounts. People are having, in the case of Wells Fargo, they just stole people's money right out of their account. So it's part of
That's high productivity.
Right. That's considered under the GDP.
Yes.
That's a GDP booster.
Yes.
When Wells Fargo commits larceny.
Absolutely.
According to Warren Buffett.
Yes.
And Charlie Munger.
Yes.
They love GDP boosting by larceny. Absolutely. So now, your dad was part of the Minneapolis 17. And as a kid, you were part of, you were spied on and surveyed by the FBI and other authorities. So you've had a taste of what people are now experiencing here in 2019, this kind of overreach by the state into everyone's personal lives through the surveillance industrial complex. But I mean, you know what it's like. So tell people what it's like.
Well, it wasn't just me. When I went to high school, the teachers, especially the social science teachers, would turn in regular reports to the FBI saying what we said in class and what our ideas were. The FBI would often come to my house, always two of them, always with crew haircuts. I could always tell who they were, and they'd want to ask my father where his loyalty would lie in a case of a war with Russia or China. I'd go out of the house, and there'd be FBI men across the street with cameras taking pictures of us coming to the house just for their files, they said. When I began to study music, there was a store that sold Russian records, and I wanted to get Russian piano music, and whenever I would go there, as I was going out to the elevator, somebody would be walking by, literally winding their camera and going into the office next door. The fact is, in the McCarthy period, everybody was spied upon. My phones were tapped, and I just expected that they knew everything that was going on. But imagine my disappointment when I read the FBI files and they found that half the information by the informants was completely wrong. They'd get the people wrong, the dates wrong, me confused with other people. And it was very nice for me to be able to remember, oh, yes, I know that person in high school, and I knew that person. It's like the diary I never kept, the FBI file. But the fact is that in the past, they had to rely on informers that were sort of like the Graham Greene character, a man in Havana, who'd make it up. And at least now, thank heavens, they get to tap your phone and read your email, and they know what you actually said. So I'm sure that the quality of surveillance has gone way up, and the current young people, when they get older, can get their files, and they'll get a much more accurate picture.
Well,
of
they've
what their
rebranded
childhood
themselves.
was like than when I was young.
Yeah, it's rebranded as Facebook.
Yes.
Right? Facebook, especially Facebook's coming out with their own coin, their own currency. So now they can track your economic. I heard someone say recently that tracking somebody's financial activity is more revealing than just tapping their phones or getting their conversations, because what you spend your money on is more of a true revealing of your identity.
Well, I just got back from a meeting at the press club in Washington, and they were telling me how the Washington Madam, the great secret the FBI was after was her book of her customers, which is what they wanted to use as a blackmail file. And as soon as she decided she wanted to move back to Germany, unfortunately, she died the day before. And many people find that not simply coincidental. And now, of course, they don't have to kill you. They already have all the information. They just want to make sure that nobody else has the information.
All right, let's talk about solutions, because this is Summer Solutions. So we touched on something earlier, and I want to get back to that. So in other words, the folks that are part of an economic model that values or measures GDP and things like how much debt you're involved, how much the Pentagon is spending on a war, everything we don't like about society, that's a GDP booster. And you're saying the left, they refuse to get involved in economics. They think that by virtual signaling and by trying to go on gender identity, that somehow this is going to restore justice to the American political system. So, but that's obviously a ridiculous notion, because the elephant in the room is that the way you measure the economy is busted, and it favors the worst kleptocrats in our society. So a GDP measure, I don't want to get too technical here, but how the GDP is all consumption effectively adjusted for trade imbalances, and then you have the GDP deflator.
And government. It's government and production and consumption, and who gets it. And it used to be, the whole purpose was a textbook picture of producers paying workers, and the workers would use their wages to buy what they produced. But that's not how the economy works. Workers don't have enough to buy what they produce. produced.
All right, so
just from getting
GDP,
wages,
that makes
they
more
borrow
sense.
money.
Okay, so how would you design a GDP number?
Well, one thing we're doing is we're taking what we call total returns. Just like if you're an investor, you take your rate of return and your capital gains. And we're adding capital gains to GDP. And the capital gains are 4 times as large as all the GDP. The economy is all about asset price inflation. It's all about credit debt leveraging to pump up the cost of housing, to pump up the cost of stocks and bonds and buying a retirement income, to essentially create capital gains for the 10% of the population that owes the vast majority of stocks and bonds and banks.
All right, so then what is your new GDP number? How is it designed?
The GDP that actually people produce and get to take home has actually been shrinking since 2008.
Right, so it's
as most people know. Your listeners must know that they're not doing as well now as they were a decade ago.
So the more accurate reflection of the economy using an accurate GDP number would show that the economy is in recession.
Yes.
It has been for a number of years.
Yes, and specifically debt deflation.
So then what would the government do to address debt deflation and GDP contraction? They would do what?
It will foreclose on the debtors, and it will turn over more and more public enterprise to the financial sector to monopolize.
So a true GDP number that shows negative numbers, it would prompt the government to enforce the laws and close banks that are carrying these huge debts illegally, essentially.
That's our objective, to say, look at how the economy really works. It's not the textbook fantasy picture that's done. And the fact is, you have to show people that the GDP has been twisted and perverted by lobbyists.
Right. So J.P. Morgan will say, you know, what do you mean we're committing fraud? Look at the GDP; it keeps going up. Right.
Yes.
So the government should say, you know what, that GDP is bogus. The economy is actually shrinking. So therefore, look at the GDP number. You're killing it. Therefore, you're going to apply the law, and you're out of business.
Apart from the fire sector. When you subtract the fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, when you say that, okay, Chase is paying its leaders millions of dollars in bonuses, but for the wage earners, for the people who actually work in factories and farms and transport and produce goods and services, their economy is shrinking. So the question is, whose economy are we talking about?
Okay.
The people's economy or Wall Street's economy?
Democrats, assuming they're more left of the aisle, I realize that's a stretch.
No, yeah, you can't.
Okay, but let's assume that there is some kind of counter narrative to the right-wing narrative, and they say in Congress, look, the economy is actually shrinking. We can prove it quite easily with these 3 charts, like boom, 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 it's shrinking.
Yes.
And we can also prove that the reason it's shrinking is debt, and we can prove that the debt's coming from banks creating money out of thin air to finance their own pockets. And therefore, what we want to do is we want to show the American people that the economy is in recession. That's why their wages aren't going very far, because we're in recession right now.
That's right.
And the reason to get out, and the way to get out of it is to get rid of the pariah state. You wrote another book called Killing the Host.
Yes.
Right? Kill the frickin' host. That's what these banks are doing. They're killing the host. We're the host. So we kill those banks. And that's the solution. Your book, that is the solution for the summer, is Killing the Host. That's the best book. This book you have now, at least the debt book, that's a great book, Dr. Michael Hudson. I mean, it's a fantastic book, but Killing the Host is a frickin' masterpiece.
Yes, that shows how the financial sector is impoverishing the economy, not making it rich.
My God, why can't you be president?
I don't have the campaign contributions that enable one to mount a successful campaign.
Well, if you were more friendlier to cryptocurrency, you could raise $500 million in a week.
Not my arena.
Right, let's dig into this a little bit more, the connection between politics and finance, because the way that they meet up is through lobbyists, right? So they've got a lot of lobbyists. Jamie Dimon's got a whole army of lobbyists in Washington, and they are really doing the devil's work. Not what Lloyd Blankfein says, the Lloyd's work.
The finance and real estate sector are symbiotic. And a few weeks ago, Donald Trump came out and said he loves depreciation, that he doesn't have to pay taxes, and he shows a loss. He said, I didn't really lose money. The statistics enable me to pretend to lose money for tax purposes, but I'm actually making a ton, thank God for depreciation. So Donald Trump and any real estate owner, not homeowners, but absentee owners, can pretend pretend that the building that they own is actually losing value, even while it's doubling and tripling in value. And this pretended loss in value is counted against the income. So if you look at the national income and product accounts for taxes paid by the real estate sector, it's just about zero since 1945. It's a tax-exempt sector.
Right, so it's losing money on the depreciation table faster than it's making money. So therefore, it's a tax write-off. The companies like Uber and others, they're going public with record losses, massive losses. And Wall Street looks at that and says, well, they're losing so much money because they're growing so fast. So therefore, they must be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. So, I mean, as a democratic country, why can't I lose money as fast as Uber? Why can't I lose money like Donald Trump loses money? How come I'm being asked to make money? Why can't I lose billions?
Because you don't give as much money to the politicians on the finance committee as the Wall Street banks and the real estate.
How much does it cost to buy a senator these days? $100,000?
It depends how you give it to them. It really helps to have naked photographs of them and blackmail. There are all sorts of inexpensive ways that the insiders usually use.
But that sounds like really the way we project the inadequacies of other countries, is that they put into power folks that are easily manipulated due to their proclivities of one or another. But this happens exactly in the United States.
Yes, we psychologists call that projection.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to vote for you for president. I don't know. You got to get ready. You're going to have to get a mistress.
No, I'd have to say the same campaign speech again and again.
Hide all those
again.
naked photos dancing in Saint-Tropez. Thanks for being on Summer Solutions, Dr. Michael Hudson. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Summer Solutions here on Keiser Report Summer Solutions. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time. Bye, y'all.